You've been in this meeting. The plan is set. The team is aligned, and someone raises a concern. The room goes quiet. The project lead smiles and says, "Let's stay positive. We've got this." And the concern gets tabled. Nobody writes it down. And 6 months later, that exact concern becomes what breaks the whole initiative. What if you had a structured, practical way to get every concern on the table before the project started? Not as a negative exercise, not as a way to talk yourself out of bold decisions, but as a purposeful practice that makes every decision you make significantly stronger. That is what this episode is about. Here's what we're covering today: a tool called the Premortem and a companion tool called the Decision Checklist, and a practical framework for using both that you can apply immediately in your next meeting. So stay with me. This one is worth your full attention. Let me start out with a question. How do you currently make high stakes decisions? Most professionals follow some version of the same process. You identify the problem or opportunity and gather some data, consult a few key people, weigh the pros and cons, and then make the call. That process is not broken, but it has a significant blind spot. And that blind spot is responsible for an uncomfortable percentage of project failures, budget overruns, and strategic misfires in organizations of every size. The blind spot is this: most decision-making processes are optimized for going forward. They're not designed to identify what could stop you. You build the business case for the new initiative. You calculate the projected ROI, and you draft the launch plan. At every step, you're thinking about what success looks like. All of that is necessary, but you also need to think in detail about what failure looks like before it happens. Here's a number that should get your attention. According to research from the Harvard Business Review, approximately 70% of organizational initiatives fail to meet their stated objectives. Not fail completely, but fall short. Scope reductions, budget overruns, missed timelines, and underperformed metrics. 7 out of 10. And one of the most consistent reasons is that decision makers and project teams systematically underestimate risks that they should have seen coming. Not black swan events, not once in a generation disruptions, but predictable operational problems that were just hiding in plain sight. A supplier or vendor relationship that was shakier than anyone acknowledged, a technology dependency that nobody stress tested, or a team capability gap that was visible but uncomfortable to raise. These are some of the risks that kill projects, and they are exactly the risks that today's tools are designed to surface. Let me tell you about a decision that I watched a company make that I still think about from time to time. It was a mid-sized marketing agency, about 60 or so employees, and they were doing steady business in their core services: website development and digital marketing for local and regional companies. And then a technology firm came along and offered them a 3-year enterprise web development contract. It was double their largest existing contract. The team was excited. Leadership was excited. The money in that contract was transformational. They took the deal. Fast forward 12 months, and they were in serious trouble. The contract demanded a level of technical complexity that required specialists that they did not have. Hiring took longer than projected. Training costs ran over. The client's technical requirements evolved faster than the team could keep pace with. By month 14, the client was threatening to exit. By month 18, they did. The loss to the firm was not just that contract. The agency had restructured its operations around that single client. And when that client left, they had a team built for work that no longer existed, and a pipeline of existing customers that had been neglected for 18 months because everyone assumed The big contract was stable. When they gathered together to complete the postmortem, here's what happened. First, it was a painful one. Almost every failure point had been visible from the start of the project. There was the technical gap, the client's aggressive change timeline, and the pipeline risk. People had seen these things coming, and some had even raised those concerns. But the energy in the room was positive. The opportunity was thrilling, and nobody had a structured framework to make those concerns stick. A premortem would likely have changed that entire conversation. Not necessarily the decision, but the conversation. A premortem is a structured exercise where you imagine that a project or decision has already failed and then work backward to try and figure out why. The concept comes from cognitive psychologist Gary Klein, and the mechanics are genuinely simple. Before you commit, before you launch, before you sign anything, you gather your team and you say this exact thing. Imagine it's 6 months from now. The project is a complete failure. So what happened? The framing in that question is doing almost all of the heavy lifting for you. When you ask your team things like what could go wrong, you're asking people to evaluate abstract risks. And humans are not necessarily wired to evaluate abstract risks well. We're optimistic by default. Our brains anchor on recent successes, and we underweight low probability events. We feel social pressure to align with whatever leadership's direction is. And all of that pulls us away from an honest risk assessment. But when you tell people that the project has already failed and then ask them to reconstruct the why, something fundamentally different happens in the conversation. You're no longer asking them to evaluate risk. You're asking them to tell a story about the past. And humans are extraordinarily good at telling stories about what went wrong. The premortem activates a different mode of thinking, and the results are consistently stronger. Research done by Deborah Mitchell and her colleagues at the Wharton School found that prospective hindsight, which is thinking about the future as though it had already happened, increased the ability to accurately identify reasons for future outcomes by 30%. When it comes to risk analysis, 30% is a meaningful improvement in your team's ability to see what they're currently missing. So let's dive into the meat and potatoes. How to actually run a premortem. And here's the process. It's pretty simple, 5 steps. Takes about an hour for a complex initiative, maybe as little as 20 to 30 minutes for something on the smaller side. Step number 1 is to set the scene. Don't ease into this. Make the failure vivid and specific. Say things like, it's 6 months from now. The project is a complete failure. We're over budget. We missed the deadline by 3 months, and the client is threatening legal action. Leadership wants a full accounting of what happened. Where did we go wrong? The specificity in the scenario matters. The more concrete the imagined failure, the more concrete the responses will be. Step number 2 is to have everyone write independently before anyone speaks. This is the step, unfortunately, that most people skip, but it's the most important one. Give everyone in the room 3, 5, 6, 10 minutes, however long it takes, to write out their failure scenarios in silence before the group discussion begins. Group conversations are often shaped by whoever speaks first, and in most organizations, that's the most senior or the most invested person. Their framing then becomes the lens through which everyone else evaluates the risk. Independent writing breaks that dynamic completely. You get raw, unfiltered thinking from every perspective in the room. Step 3 is to collect everything without judgment. Go around the room or on the call and have each person share one item from their list. No evaluation, none of the, well, we already addressed that. No pushback, just capture. Your goal in this phase is volume, not quality. You're building the most comprehensive picture of the potential failure landscape that you can construct. Step 4 is to prioritize by likelihood and impact. Once you have the full list, Work through it together. Which scenarios are most likely to occur? Which would be the most damaging if they did? Where those two things intersect, that's your priority zone. You can do this as a conversation or use a simple 2x2 matrix with likelihood on one axis and impact on the other. Either way, you're identifying which risks are worth spending time on before you commit to any one path. Step 5 is to assign ownership with deadlines. For each high priority risk, name a specific person who owns that risk. Their job is to either eliminate the risk or develop a mitigation plan before the project launches. Give them a deadline, give them a check-in structure. A we'll revisit it later isn't a deadline. A date on a calendar is a deadline. In a nutshell, that's a premortem. When it prevents a six-figure mistake, the ROI on that hour that it took to complete is essentially incalculable. Let me bring this to life at a smaller scale, because premortems are often dismissed as tools for major corporate projects at Fortune 500 companies, but they work at every level of business. And we'll use our favorite delicious example, Toby's taco truck. It had been running solo for 3 years in a downtown business district. Strong lunch crowd, loyal regulars, and solid reviews. Then an opportunity came by. A technology company wanted to book the truck for a full-day catering event. The event was a corporate outdoor festival, roughly 400 guests, from 11 a.m. to 3 p.m. The contract value was the single biggest revenue day in the truck's history. In that scenario, Toby's obvious answer was yes. The math worked. The food was dialed in, and he knew the operation inside and out. So where could the problem possibly be? Before signing, Toby did a 20-minute premortem. The scenario was, it's the day after the event, and it was a complete disaster. The client is demanding a full refund and threatening a public review. So where did the wheels come off the taco truck? This is what he came up with. The kitchen could not handle the volume. The truck was built and designed for a lunch rush that builds and tapers over 90-ish minutes. But 400 people in a 4-hour window constitutes a completely different demand curve. At its peak, ticket times tripled. The line stretched off the client's property, and guests started leaving before they even had a bite. The supply chain completely broke down. Feeding 400 people at once required 3 times the normal weekly protein volume. His primary supplier couldn't fill the order on a 2-week notice, and the backup supplier's quality was inconsistent at best. The tacos at 2 p.m. were not the tacos that people showed up expecting. Staffing on the truck completely collapsed. One additional helper was not enough for that volume. Service slowed to a crawl. The register area became a bottleneck, and operational stress started to show up in food quality. Now, none of those are devastating on their own, but combined together, they describe an event that would have generated 1-star reviews at best, torched a relationship with a company that employed 600 people who all eat lunch somewhere, and turned the biggest revenue opportunity in the truck's history into its most visible failure. The premortem didn't obliterate the deal, but it changed the deal. The owner went back to the tech company and negotiated a slightly higher rate that covered 2 additional staffers instead of just 1. He locked in a second protein supplier ahead of time before committing, and simplified the menu that day specifically for high volume output. At the end of the day, the event ran clearly. The customer was happy, and they booked a follow-up event 3 months later. That is the premortem working exactly as designed. It doesn't stop you from taking the leap, but it helps to make sure that you don't trip up on the landing. Now, let's talk about its companion tool. The premortem is excellent at surfacing failure scenarios. It identifies what might go wrong, but it does not systematically address the decision-making process itself. That's where the decision checklist comes in. A decision checklist is a structured set of questions that you work through before finalizing any high-stakes decision. Its purpose is to ensure that you haven't skipped the critical thinking steps in the rush. to move forward. I know what some of you might be thinking. A checklist. I've been making decisions my entire life. I don't need a checklist. And that's a fair reaction, but hear me out for a second, because the research on this is a little uncomfortable. In 2009, the World Health Organization introduced a standard 19-item surgical safety checklist into hospitals across 8 countries. The results, as published in the New England Journal of Medicine, were striking. Major complication rates dropped by 36% and deaths dropped by 47%. These were not inexperienced surgeons. These were trained professionals with decades of combined expertise. The checklist caught things that their training, expertise, and professional confidence simply missed. Pilots use pre-flight checklists before every single flight, not because they forgot how to fly since last week, but because low probability, high consequence errors do not respect experience levels. A checklist is a cognitive backstop. It protects against the specific failure mode that expertise tends to create, and that's overconfidence. There's a well-documented research phenomenon, sometimes called the Dunning-Kruger effect. But this is the specific version of it that applies to true experts in any field. The more competent that you become in your domain, the more likely you are to underestimate the complexity of risks within that domain. Expertise creates blind spots, and checklists address those blind spots directly. When it comes to your checklist, you don't need a complicated system. So here's a framework organized into 5 categories that works for the vast majority of high-stakes decisions. Category 1 is clarity. Can you state the decision you're making in one clear sentence? If you cannot, you haven't identified it clearly enough yet to make an informed decision. This sounds kind of obvious, but it's almost never done. Do you know what success looks like and how you'll measure it? If your success metrics are vague, you cannot assess whether the decision actually worked. Have you defined the point of no return? At what moment does this decision become either very difficult or impossible to reverse? Knowing that date matters. Category 2 is stakeholders. Who's affected by this decision beyond the obvious people in the room? Have you gotten input from all the people who would be impacted, not just the people who will agree with you? Is there someone in your organization who thinks this is a bad idea? And have you actually listened to their reasoning, or have you just dismissed it? That last question is the one that most leaders skip. The person who disagrees with you is often the most valuable voice in the room. Their objection might be wrong, but it also might be the thing that saves you. Category 3 is data. What data are you relying on, and how confident are you in its accuracy? Not how confident do you feel, but how confident should you be based on the source? What additional data would change your mind? And is there any way to get any of that data before you make a final decision? Are you making your decision based on facts, or are you making your decision based on the narrative that you have built around the facts? This is the really dangerous one. Humans are story-making creatures. We take data points and construct them into a narrative that makes sense to us. But the narrative isn't the data. Sometimes the narrative is just optimism dressed in a spreadsheet. Category 4 is risk. What is the worst realistic outcome if this fails? Not the worst imaginable outcome, but the worst realistic one. Those are 2 different things. Can your organization, your team, or your project survive that outcome? And critically, have you run a premortem based on that outcome? Category 5 is reversibility. How easy is it to reverse this decision if it doesn't work out? I like to think of this as a 2-door framework. Some decisions are 2-way doors. You can go through, and if it doesn't work, you can turn around and walk back through. A new hire that doesn't work out might be expensive and uncomfortable, but it's recoverable. Entering a new market that doesn't land is painful, but you can still pull back. Those types of decisions deserve solid due diligence, but they don't need to be agonized over. On the other hand, one-way doors are different. Signing a 10-year lease or selling an entire division, going public, some certain acquisitions and strategic partnerships. Those decisions are much harder or even impossible to reverse. They deserve a level of scrutiny that most teams simply just do not apply. Your checklist ensures that you apply the right level of rigor to the right type of decision. Most people apply similar levels of scrutiny to both, and that's a significant mistake. Here's how premortems and decision checklists work in tandem. Because when used in sequence, they create a decision-making process that is meaningfully better than what most organizations currently use. Step number one is to make your tentative decision. Get to the point where you know what you're inclined to do. Don't finalize it, just hold it loosely and openly. Step two is to run your decision checklist. Go through each category and flag any answers that are weak, incomplete, or built around assumptions that you have not fully tested. Make a note of what you do not know yet. Step three is to run your premortem. With your tentative decision on the table, bring the team together and ask them to imagine it has failed. Collect their failure scenarios and add your own. Make the picture as complete as you can. Step four is to map the overlap. Look at where your checklist gaps and your premortem failure scenarios intersect. If something shows up in both places, that is not a peripheral concern. That is a priority that needs to be addressed before finalizing any decision. That might mean gathering additional data, adjusting the scope of the decision, or building a contingency plan. Or it might mean deciding not to proceed at all, but at least it's a fully informed choice. Step number five is to decide. Make the call, not with false certainty, because certainty in decision-making is largely a myth, but with clear eyes, a documented process, and a record of how you got there. When things go wrong later, and sometimes they will, that record becomes your foundation for learning rather than just a source of regret. I want to close out the episode with a thought about what these tools represent beyond the mechanics. Leaders who use premortems and decision checklists do not become timid or indecisive. In my experience, the opposite happens. They become more decisive because they're not paralyzed by unexamined fear. They've looked at the risk directly and they know what they're taking on. And they're moving forward because they fully assess the situation, not because they avoided doing so. The leaders who skip this process are not braver. They are less informed. And in a high-stakes environment, the difference between courage and recklessness is almost always the quality of the thinking that preceded the action. Great leaders do not avoid failure. They prepare for it. They plan around it, and they learn from it systematically. Premortems and decision checklists are just two of the most practical, accessible, and immediately applicable tools in that particular toolkit. Bring them into your next project kickoff. Use them on your next major hire. Apply them to the next budget decision or strategic initiative, and pay attention to what changes when you do. That's it for this particular episode. If it was useful for you, there is more where that came from. Every week on Toby Talks, we go deep into practical tools and frameworks for leaders, professionals, and anyone who just wants to get better at what they do. Hit that subscribe or follow button so that you don't miss an episode. And if you want to go further, come find us at toby-talks.com. There is content there that goes above and beyond what we cover in any single episode. Have a great rest of the day, and I'll see you in the next one.